Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Week's digital show, Washington Week Recommends. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Each week, I recommend great reporting that I think deserves your attention. And today, I want to highlight two fascinating articles, which I think really does provide helpful context following these fairly surprising, and I should say, ongoing midterm results. They are, quote, two headlines: "The Divided States of America" and "America Has an Anti-MAGA Majority." They're both featured in The Atlantic, and they were both written by David Graham. And he joins me now. Welcome, David, to Washington Week Recommends. And I want to start off by reading part of the first article that we highlight, the one, of course, entitled "America Has an Anti-MAGA Majority." You wrote this, quote, "Not for the first time, Biden has both the last laugh and a better intuition about voters than his critics assume. The midterm election results," you write, "which appear to have delivered Republicans only modest gains, show that although a sizable minority of Americans will never defect from Trump, an even larger group seems equally determined to stop Trumpism." You write on to say the existence of this anti-MAGA coalition is essential to understanding not only this election, but also the 2024 race. And you also write, in a traditional midterm election, the president's party suffers, but the regular pattern broke. So tell me, David, when you look at this, tell me a little bit about your findings there and what really inspired you to write what I was just reading there.
You know, we saw in the last week of the campaign, Biden gave the speech about democracy, which was widely panned when people paid any attention to it, which was not a lot. And what you saw is a lot of smart people saying, you know, this focus on democracy may be morally right, but it's just not something that voters care about. They care about inflation, they care about abortion, they care about this and that, but this is just too abstract. And looking around at the results, I felt like that conventional wisdom and my intuition about it was wrong. You saw these anti-democratic candidates, you know, election deniers being rejected, and you saw voters coming out to support Democrats. And I think the reason for that, as we see from exit polling and a few other indicators, is that they do care about these democracy issues, and they've shown that. They showed that in 2018, they showed that in 2020, and they've showed that again this year.
Certainly, I remember in real time, there are a lot of people, including even Democrats, saying you should really be focusing President Biden on inflation and not about talking about democracy. But you're saying that this could possibly, that strategy and his ability to sort of walk and chew gum, as the president's been saying, that it could lead to the best midterm results of any president, at least in the last couple of decades. Is that correct, David?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it turns out that those kitchen table issues are important, but they're not as important in this new sort of Trump influenced paradigm as a lot of people assumed, as much as I assumed. You know, the regular rules just don't quite apply in the way we thought they might be returning this year with Trump off the ballot.
I also want to quote this progressive strategist that you wrote about. You say, "When elections are clearly about Trump and MAGA will lose. There's now something really at stake in the elections, and what matters more if I go out and vote." So talk a bit about that, because you're hearing on the Republican side some people questioning whether or not Trump is a, quote, drag on the party. Tell me more about what that strategist told you and what it says about sort of where we are right now.
Yeah, you know, this guy named Michael Podhorzer, and he went back to 2018, where you saw a huge number of people turn out, midterm turnout higher than this year, it appears, and really the highest in quite a long time. And the reason was people were voting against Trump, and they were voting against the sort of, you know, the whole suite of his agenda. A lot of his voters came out too, but there's these other people. He drives turnout on both sides. And so that meant there was this big pool of people who might vote in the midterms, and they came out again this year. They care about these things, then they're willing to turn out. It's not just a question of persuasion. It's also a question of people who might otherwise just not bother, who, you know, they might be discouraged about inflation. They might be discouraged about their own pocketbook, but they're upset about, you know, threats to democracy, threats to rule of law, threats to rights like abortion. And that means they come out where they wouldn't have in past cycles.
And you also, when you think about sort of the turnout and people coming out, I was in Michigan, where that state saw record turnout. It was a very big night, a very historic night for Michigan Democrats who are winning. And you write about one of the candidates that lost in Michigan, that of course being Christina Caramo. She was someone who was questioning the results of the 2020 election. You could say she was an election denier. You say that many election deniers lost, but you also say that too many won. I wonder if you could peel that back a little, because there's a lot of focus on the ones that lost, but I wonder about the ones that won.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many of them that many of these folks did win. And I think, you know, what we need to learn is a little bit is how many of these people are kind of opportunistic. They're hopping on this bandwagon because they realize it's what Trump is pushing, and they think it's what appeals to voters. And how many of them are true believers? And we look at somebody like Christina Caramba, we look at, Mark Fincham in Arizona, and I think some of these people truly do believe. Some of them may be just doing it because it is what they think is popular. And I think what they do in office will be a test. But when there are so many Republicans who question the system, some of them are going to win, and that's going to be something we need to keep an eye on and be worried about for future elections, security and for faith in elections.
And in talking about tests, this was also a test in the decision by some Democrats to meddle. That's what people would call it, meddle in the elections. There were some Democrats who pushed for election deniers in the primaries because they thought they were going to be easier to beat. And records show so far that they were right about that. That at least from what I can tell, it was a clean sweep of candidates who were backed by Democrats, Republican candidates. They all lost. What's that tell you about the state of politics? But also, I wonder what the lesson is there for Democrats and maybe even for Republicans.
Yeah, and it's, the warning is that is a dangerous game to play. And I think that is still possible. In a lot of these cases, what they were doing was simply saying this candidate is too extreme. And that may have boosted them in the primary, but it also maybe helped to define them for the general electorate. And it seems like for a lot of voters, they were too extreme. Even if they were dissatisfied with Democrats, they just weren't willing to take a risk on these sorts of candidates. So, you can imagine it going too far. You can imagine it backfiring. But in this case, I think the message was consistent and it was something that resonated with a lot of voters.
And a lot of the voters that this resonated with were independent voters, which you write about. I want to ask you about the quote, meh voters. I love that term, meh voters. Our friend Amy Walter at the Cook Political Report is using it to describe independent voters who maybe disapproved of the president, but stuck with Democrats anyways. Tell me about those results there.
Yeah, I love that description. And so this is a group of voters, their approval of Biden is not very good. It's either somewhat disapprove or on the fence. They're worried about the economy. So these aren't people who would typically be excited about voting for Democrats. And there maybe are people who wouldn't bother to turn out or might vote for a middle of the road Republican because they want change. And among these voters, they're going for Democrats rather, by a good margin. And I think that is another sign of just how much people are motivated by these questions of Democratic issues and the sort of MAGA suite being something they just don't really want.
Yeah. I also want to ask you about abortion, because that played a big part, a clean sweep again for people who are in favor of abortion rights. 5 states voted on ballot initiatives related to abortion. All 5 voted in ways that would not restrict access to abortion. What's that tell you about the driving force there? And I know you talked about sort of that versus democracy, but I wonder what you make of sort of where things landed there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is clearly a big motivator. We see that up and down the board. And I think that's also, there is a connection there with the sort of MAGA agenda. Republicans have been talking about appointing pro-life judges for a long time, but Donald Trump actually delivered. He actually got pro-life justices on the court and got the decision that people wanted. So that is part of the MAGA agenda too. But it's another example of something that voters maybe just aren't that excited about. They may have liked things about Trump, but it turns out that was a right that for many people remained something they wanted to have in the Constitution.
I was also fascinated by the fact that you talk about the January 6th committee hearings. There was a lot of talk that maybe people aren't paying attention. Again, going back to pocketbook issues, people weren't tuning in. But when you think about people like Liz Cheney and Elaine Luria, both now lawmakers who are projected to lose their seats, and with Liz Cheney having already lost her seat, but who staked really their future, the future of the democracy on explaining to Americans just how dangerous January 6th was. What impact do you think that might have had on this election?
There's a real time correlation between when those hearings hit their peak over the summer and when Democrats surged on the generic ballot and started to do better in a lot of these polls. That also coincides with the Dobbs decision, but I think we can't throw out the January 6th thing. And it's true, the ratings were not always spectacular for them. And maybe people didn't understand or didn't grasp all of the details of it. But when you have this in the headlines and you have people talking about what happened on January 6th and about, what happened before January 6th, also the sort of legal attempts to subvert the election, that reminded voters that they hated that. We saw it back in January 2021 and February 2021. People don't like that. And simply, I think by reminding them that this is what Trump represents and what a lot of the sort of Trump acolytes in the Republican Party represent, hurt Republicans and boosted Democrats.
Yeah. I also want to ask you about the calcification of American politics. You write about that. Describe the concept and how it's impacting our politics.
Yeah, there's a great book called The Bitter End by 3 political scientists that introduces this idea. And it says, it's hard to understand how elections can be so close and yet everything can feel so tense. And they argue that what we're seeing is a sort of calcification. People are so polarized that and closely polarized. That there's neither party can ever gain a large majority, and people feel very strongly. They feel the other party is an existential threat, so they're going to come out for all these elections. So you have high turnout, high polarization, and what that gives us is elections where things don't shift much. So 2018 was a big election for Democrats, but what it did really was bring things back closer to an equilibrium. And so in 2018, in 2020, and now in 2022, we see it's very hard for either party to win a big majority. Republicans gain, but not very much. And I think that is probably the future for a while. As long as we are this polarized, and as long as people feel strongly, you're not going to see big shifts, but you are going to get a lot of anxiety and a lot of tension from these elections. So that should be a lot of fun for all of us.
Well, a lot of anxiety and a lot of tension is exactly how I would describe my Friday right now, as we're all waiting for these results. I also want to talk about the other article that you wrote, which was, of course, the one titled "The Divided States of America." And in there, you wrote, quote, GOP gains on Capitol Hill are the most important headline in immediate policy terms because they mean that President Joe Biden will be unable to move his priorities through Congress and will face new investigations and oversight. This may prove to be the best midterm performance, you write as well, though, by the sitting president's party since 2002. Voters of both parties now view elections not just as chances to shape the direction of government policy, but as existential battles. Tell me about writing that, because it's of course both. This is one of the best midterm results by a sitting president's party, but also his agenda might be stalled for the next 2 years.
Yeah, and part of that is it just has to do with how closely divided things have been already. I think that it's very important to recognize that a Republican win is a big deal. We're talking about how well Democrats did, and that is important. It does buck historical trends, but obviously having a Republican House, if that is in fact what comes out as it seems, is really important. That will change things a lot. Even as we look at the sort of broad historical sweep and what this might mean for 2024. And I think this is where the calcified politics come in. You're just never going to have a party that has the sort of huge advantage that we saw, in the 30s or in the 60s or in the 80s for either party. It's going to be closely divided, and we're going to see things going back and forth. If not every 2 years, maybe every 4 years. It's going to be very volatile.
And in talking about that sort of volatility and parties having to share power, I'm struck by something that you wrote about, which is also ticket splitting. I know I talked to some voters who said, I'm not voting for Tudor Dixon, but I am going to vote for Proposal 3, or I interviewed a woman who voted for, and just to remind people, Tudor Dixon was a woman who was running for governor, a Republican woman running for governor in Michigan. The Democratic governor, Gretchen Whitmer, she won re-election. I talked to a voter who said, well, I did vote for Gretchen Whitmer, but I voted against this proposal to enshrine abortion rights into the state constitution there, even though overall that initiative passed. But in some ways, I'm getting at the long-winded way of saying there are people who are splitting their tickets all across America, voters who are saying, I like this, but I don't like that. How do they play into this and the future of divided government, as you put it?
I think they're the real asterisk to this sort of polarization. And it shows that there are some things that for voters, simply they do have views that don't fit with one party. Maybe they care about democracy issues, but they also think that they are also pro-life. Or maybe they like a Republican who's a little bit more middle of the road, but some people are simply too much for them. And that's an example where maybe we do see some polarization softening, or at least temporarily softening. The one thing I'd say about that is we see ticket splitting is historically still down over where it used to be. So we got a little bit more ticket splitting, it seems, this year than we did, say, 6-8 years ago. But we're still well below the historical normal, because people do approach politics so much more as a team sport, and the parties are so unified in a way they didn't used to be.
And David, you've brought this up a couple times. It makes my head spin, but I'm going to ask about it. 2024. I can't believe I even have to go there, but here we are. President Trump is teasing that he's going to make a big announcement next week. President Biden is saying he's intending to run, but it's going to be a family decision when he finally makes that decision. We've already seen former President Trump going after Ron DeSantis, who won big in Florida to continue to be the governor there. He's also going after Glenn Youngkin, who's the governor of Virginia. He's someone who also is seen as a potential presidential candidate. What are you thinking of when you think of the 2024 stakes, where things are, especially I'll start on the GOP side, since we're seeing a lot of talk there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm anxious about all of it. On the GOP side, I can understand why Trump wants to announce now. He has, or very soon, he has all these rivals who are gaining steam. And I think that he does have real weaknesses. You see conservative media turn against him, and you see people saying, "Wait a second, this guy lost the popular vote in 2016. He led us to a loss in 2018. He lost in 2020, and he lost in 2022. Why would we want to try this again?" I think the wild card there, not even a wild card, it's the voters. The conservative establishment has never liked Trump, even if they made accommodations. And the question is whether those voters are willing to stick with him and still, sort of adore him in the way they did, or whether they're willing to, take a chance on Ron DeSantis, to fall in love with somebody new. And on the Democratic side, I keep being surprised sometimes by how Biden plays a long game and gets places on these strategic questions, like on the democracy issues. But the fact remains that a lot of Democrats think that he's too old or think that it's time for something fresh. But the question is whether there's another Democrat who can perform as well against Trump, presumptively, or another Republican as he can. And I think that it's an empty field at this point of who is proven to be able to do that.
Yeah. Well, a lot of questions about 2022 and 2024. Hopefully you'll come back and keep talking to us about this. So thank you so much, David, for joining us and for sharing your reporting. And thanks to all of you for watching Washington Week Recommends, our beloved digital show. You can find us here every Friday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And of course, tonight, be sure to tune in to Washington Week on PBS. We'll examine the latest in the battle for control of Congress as key races all across the country remain undecided. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tonight.